Great. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you to anybody who's watching online. And thanks especially to Matt and to Steve for inviting me to be here to talk with you today. I've reluctantly titled my talk Alt Academic Careers. Reluctantly because I'm eagerly anticipating a moment when we can simply talk about postgraduate career paths without the unspoken assumption automatically being that obtaining both a Ph.D. and a tenure track career is the most desirable outcome. And yet I do continue to use the term because we're not there yet, and because it bears frequent repeating that a faculty position isn't the only place where one can do scholarly work. The question of career paths can't be separated from the growing problem of increased reliance on contingent faculty members who work in unsustainable conditions. The vast majority of students entering PhD programs do so with the goal of becoming professors. But even while university enrollments continue to grow, tenure lines are hardly increasing at all. Instead, increasing numbers of students are accommodated by hiring contingent faculty members. As graduates try to gain a foothold and work their way up the academic ladder, many instead spend years treading water in positions with poor working conditions, including very low pay, few or no benefits, and no long-term job security. And as student bodies grow and the need for additional instructors increases, the proportion of contingent faculty members grows larger and larger. 2011 data from the Department of Education reports that over 75% of instructional faculty members in 2- and 4-year institutions are in contingent positions. It's not that tenure lines are decreasing in terms of absolute numbers, they're just not increasing to keep pace with the growth. While labor conditions in these positions vary widely, they show few signs of improving in the short term. In Inside Higher Ed's 2013 survey of chief academic officers, an astonishing 89% of provosts indicated that they expect to rely on an equal or even greater proportion of contingent faculty members in the years to come. And even measures that seem that they should promote positive change, such as the Affordable Care Act's requirement that employees working more than 30 hours per week receive health benefits from their employer, can actually end up exacerbating the issue. In this particular case, many universities are actually cutting adjuncts' hours to ensure that they don't cross that 30-hour threshold, leaving adjuncts with no health care and with fewer paid hours than they had previously. The problem of poor working conditions for contingent faculty should concern everyone who values scholarship and learning. But many know little about the labor structures of universities until their career prospects are directly implicated. Right now is an important moment to push for greater transparency about academic labor issues and alternative career outcomes, as labor issues often remain in the shadows even as they affect an ever greater proportion of faculty and students. Further, many students bear astronomical levels of debt once they complete their degrees, making the preparation for rewarding, sustainable careers doubly important. In order to make responsible decisions, graduate students need accurate and thorough information about employment outcomes from their programs. But this information is rarely, if ever, made available. And in fact, CUNY Graduate Center does a better job than most of actually making this information available to students and to the public. More broadly, transparency about career outcomes is a tool for public advocacy, as it helps to show how humanities education has an impact in many different sectors. Such public engagement is crucial, especially as humanities programs nationwide are facing increasing budgetary threats. Despite the importance of the conversation, until recently there was very little data that was available about the increasingly visible body of what have become known as alternative academic scholars. Often called alt-ac, the term is a useful shorthand to refer to people with advanced training in the humanities who don't pursue careers as tenure-track faculty members, but instead work in and around academic structures and public environments in arenas like libraries, museums, archives, humanities centers and labs, presses, and more. The opportunities that such varied careers afford may seem evident, and yet in many ways our universities continue to suggest to students that tenure-track faculty careers are the gold standard for graduates. This can happen in subtle or explicit ways. A department might track its successful placements, in quotes, for instance, but only include academic appointments in the count. or an advisor may simply not know what resources to offer to a student, leading the student to believe that such opportunities are not available. This is a mistake, not only for students who want to secure meaningful employment, but also for our society, which becomes richer as deeply trained humanists enter the workforce in many different venues. The traditional academic path is frequently imagined as a pipeline. From the time a child enters school, the next transition point is always built into the infrastructure. And as students exit the academic system at various points, the imagined pipeline becomes progressively narrower. This pipeline is sometimes described as being leaky, and a number of studies and projects explore ways of retaining students within the defined trajectory. While it's undoubtedly important to ensure that students aren't leaving their studies sooner than they'd like to because of, for instance, a lack of mentorship or inadequate support, relying on the image of a pipeline and lamenting its leaks creates, I think, two big problems. First, most people's careers don't look at all like a predetermined path, except perhaps in retrospect as one tries to connect the dots. And second, the notion of keeping people in may be an unhelpful way to think about the aims and values of higher education. Instead, humanities programs should be celebrating the ways in which students translate their education and expertise into unexpected domains. This is not to say that we shouldn't critically examine the points at which students tend to exit, especially if students are leaving because of structural issues that impoverish the scholarly ecosystem. But we need to do a better job of recognizing the incredible value that dispersal has for our society, for our disciplines, and for individual scholars. For that reason, I like to think of humanities education not as a pipeline, but as a sprinkler with water exploding out in all directions. It's a rather simplistic image, but I do think that it's helpful, especially since a sprinkler's outward spray is reminiscent of both utility and joy. Rather than focusing academic work exclusively within academic institutions, humanities programs should be preparing students for much more flexibility in terms of audience and engagement. Some humanities disciplines, such as history, do have a strong tradition in public engagement. Public history is a well-developed subdiscipline, and many scholars work in museums, government, archives, and so on. But even there, it seems that the public branch has often been considered distinct from, and unfortunately less prestigious than, the research-focused side of the discipline. The humanities must get more serious about its role relative to the public for a number of reasons. First, if we believe that our work can be a social good with broad relevance to our cultures and societies, then we should be attentive to the public value of our work for reasons intrinsic to the work itself. Some of the most interesting research and projects being done today is produced by scholars that are outside of the tenure track, and yet because of their positions, their work is not always recognized within the scholarly system. Second, as public funding for the humanities becomes increasingly scarce, we must make a case for continued and strengthened support. If our work is not even visible, let alone relevant to a broader public outside the academic audience, then we have a very weak case indeed. Third, as I've noted, it has long been the case that a large proportion of graduates engage in careers outside the professoriate, and yet those roles have typically been undervalued. We owe it to current and future graduate students to equip them for a broader range of roles and to attribute to those roles the merit that they deserve. And yet, despite the exciting possibilities that a sprinkler-like approach can offer, pipelines remain reassuring because it's easy to know where to go next. When scholars first begin exploring other kinds of career options, the process can feel overwhelming, not least because the field is simply so broad. People need signposts to make it easier to know where others have gone before them and what they might consider as options for themselves. The problem with signposts on the alternative academic track, though, is that they're not always where you expect them to be. Not only have I found this to be true in my own experience, but based on my recent work researching career paths of humanities scholars with the Scholarly Communication Institute, as Matt mentioned, I also believe that a certain degree of unpredictability is very common in almost all alternative academic career paths. Until earlier this year, I was working with SCI, a Mellon-funded humanities think tank that dedicated 10 years to investigating the changing environment of scholarly communication, graduate education, and more. Part of my job there was to design and administer a survey of people with advanced humanities degrees who had pursued career paths beyond the tenure track. Though respondents worked in a wide range of fields, the survey revealed an incredibly common pattern, that of serendipity and unpredictability in any individual's career trajectory. Many reported finding themselves in satisfying jobs that they not only didn't expect to pursue when they started their studies, but frequently ones that they didn't even know existed at that time. Indeed, it can be very difficult to know what kinds of opportunities might open up into promising career paths. This is certainly true for me, as you might be able to guess from looking at my own trajectory. And I'm about to pull back the curtain on a lot of my own experiences, so take it for what it's worth. The first significant step in my post-academic career was primarily a means of hedging my bets. I had moved cross-country while working on my dissertation, so I no longer had any institutional funding and needed an income while I continued to write. I started working actually with a temp agency whose clients were primarily foundations and nonprofits. The work was honestly not very interesting in itself, but learning the inner workings of grant-making organizations fascinated me. A few of my short-term jobs were with the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, which funds research in science and technology. I established strong relationships with a number of the foundation's staff members, and when a full-time position opened, they invited me to apply. As I see it, this particular opportunity worked out for a number of reasons. For one thing, Sloan is an institution that places a high value on scholarship. Though I was trained in a different field than most of my science-minded colleagues, they respected the discipline and the deep curiosity that graduate study implies. In addition, my resume showed that I was an effective translator, both in terms of language, but also more figuratively, in terms of articulating ideas across different groups of people or disciplines. I had previously worked part-time at another science organization, the International Union of Geodesy and Geophysics, which was a position that I didn't think would have any bearing on my future career path at all. But looking back, I'm convinced that it made me a more appealing candidate to Sloan. Finally, and perhaps most vexingly, I had a foot in the door through the temp jobs. The staff had seen the quality of my work as well as my personality and were eager to keep me with them full time. And I think the question of how to get that foot in the door somewhere is one of the most complicated when we talk about career searches. While at Sloan, my responsibilities steadily increased, and by the end of my employment, I was actively contributing to the strategic development of an entirely new program area called Digital Information Technology. While still rooted in STEM fields, the new program had much in common with the digital humanities and the changing terrain of scholarly communication that was happening across all academic fields. At the same time, I was gaining invaluable understanding about the grant evaluation process, as well as the nuts and bolts of organizational structures and operations, which were things that I certainly had not learned as a graduate student. Another thing that my work at Sloan taught me was that some of the most interesting conversations about higher education were happening in open online environments like Twitter. This is probably old news for many of you in the room, but it was new for me at the time. And so as I began looking for new opportunities for growth, I made a pointed effort to develop a more professional online presence than I had ever previously done. I connected with people on Twitter, I blogged about issues in higher education, and I listened into online conversations to get a feel for who was doing the kind of work that I found interesting and what kind of positions they were in so that I knew even what to look for as I was searching for a job of my own. This was how I eventually connected with Bethany Novisky, who was my boss at my previous position at SCI. Without the work that I had done at Sloan, I doubt that I ever would have even caught wind of the work that SCI was doing. When I began that role at SCI, new challenges awaited me. I had no prior background in quantitative analysis or survey methodology, so I knew that I would have to learn and apply a very complex set of skills very quickly. To have opportunities for such continued growth is exciting for me, and I think that these kinds of opportunities are possible precisely because I've applied my deep academic training to a non-faculty job. In September, I began my current position as managing editor of MLA Commons, which, as Matt already described, is the Modern Language Association's new online platform. It fosters new modes of scholarly communication and collegial networking for its members. You're all actually very familiar with the structure of it because it's been based on the same system as CUNY Academic Commons, thanks to the hard work of Matt Gold and others. While the role is very different from any of my previous positions, for the first time I can sense, looking back, a certain cohesiveness in the direction that my career is taking. Each step on my professional journey has been unpredictable, but increasingly enriching and satisfying. It certainly wasn't a trajectory that I had visualized at the outset of my studies. At each transition point, I have not known what the subsequent change would be, and so my path has been characterized by a great deal of searching, self-evaluating, and maintaining flexibility. For me, I found that the Ph.D. was a slippery credential. In some professional settings, it hasn't been relevant at all. In others, it led people to trust me to take on difficult tasks like strategic development at Sloan or the survey at SCI, even though they were outside of my area of expertise. In almost all cases, though, holding a graduate degree meant that I enjoyed a greater degree of credibility, especially among current and former faculty members or others who are deeply involved in higher education. The key factors for me on my path have been to seek mentors, to open myself up both to people and to opportunities, to take steps that seem promising even if I don't know what their logical outcome is going to be, and not to be afraid of my own backup plans. I haven't planned each step in advance, but I've always maintained a sense of growth and progress that help to ensure that I'm a competitive candidate for whatever the next role will be. The flexibility of my path is, for me, one of its most appealing qualities. I feel a much stronger sense of agency in crafting my career than I might have had I followed a more straightforward path. Another key to developing a satisfying career path is learning to recognize your transferable skills and learning to articulate skills in a way that resonates with various different employers. What are you doing now as a graduate student that employers want? At SCI, we tried to get a sense of how to answer this question by polling two groups of people. First, people with advanced humanities degrees who self-identified as working in alternative academic careers. And second, employers that oversee people with advanced humanities degrees. Here you can see some of the competencies that both groups considered important to the ALTAC positions that they either hold or supervise. Sorry, I know the font size is a little bit small on that, but feel free to move up if you'd like to see more closely. Some of the skills are core elements of graduate work, such as writing, research, and analytical skills. However, there are a couple of discrepancies, and it's the discrepancies that I find interesting. For one thing, ALTAC employees tended to undervalue their research relative to their employers. I suspect that there may be two reasons for this. First, there may be some activities that employees actually don't recognize as research because they lead to a different end result than the employee might expect. Such as a decision being made within an institution rather than a journal article being published, as we might expect in an academic environment. Second, it might be a skill that has simply become so natural that former grad students fail to recognize it as something that really sets them apart in their jobs. Whatever the reason, the discrepancy highlights the importance that students not undervalue or insufficiently articulate the ways that graduate study already equips them for broader roles, especially in the methods and generalized skills that are critical in the process. On the other hand, ALTAC employees tended to overvalue the importance of project management relative to their employers, among competencies that their jobs required. But that said, project management actually tops the list of areas where ALTAC employees needed training, according to their employers. So it sounds a bit confusing. Employers think that the skill is not among the most important for the job, but it was an area that they saw that frequently needed improvement. So to me, this difference suggests that employees may have been overvaluing the skill because it was actually something that they found difficult and that they needed to learn once they were on the job because they hadn't been trained in it previously. Employers also cited technical and managerial skills as areas that needed training. And while the importance of those two skills would certainly depend on the type of position as to whether they were relevant or not, others, such as collaboration, are useful in almost any environment and could easily be worked into graduate curricula. So where are people working after graduate school? A large majority of the respondents categorize their positions as being within universities, libraries, and other cultural heritage organizations, which I think is not particularly surprising. But parenthetically, this is one area where the definition of alt-ac gets a little bit fuzzy. Some people prefer to think of alternative academic careers as only those that are within the university but outside the tenure track. Personally, I tend to take a much broader view of what alt-ac can signify. I think it's useful to consider not so much a specific job or a career, but rather to think about an approach, a way of seeing one's work through the lens of academic training and of incorporating scholarly methods into the way that that work is done. The reasons that people pursue careers beyond the tenure track are varied and complex. Location tops the list, which makes sense as a contrast to the near total lack of geographic choice afforded by academic job searches. Beyond that, people report pursuing alt-ac jobs for reasons ranging from the practical and immediate, such as salary, benefits, and family considerations, to more future and goal-oriented reasons, such as the desire to gain new skills, contribute to society, or advance in one's career. Many people completed their own responses as well, frequently noting a desire for greater freedom, dissatisfaction with what a faculty career would look like, or much more simply, the need to find a job. The good news is that all of the elements that help candidates to be competitive in varied career paths that help them to achieve their personal goals would also be hugely beneficial for those grads that do go on to become professors. The skills foregrounded by the survey responses can contribute to much more creative teaching and research, and would also help prepare students for the service aspect of a professorship. By rethinking their curricula in such a way that students gain experience in things like collaborative project development and public engagement, departments would be strengthening their students' future prospects, regardless of the paths that the students choose to take. A great example of this collaborative environment is the vibrant dynamic of programs like CUNY's digital humanities initiatives, and especially the Digital Fellows program, which illustrate the potential creative and scholarly rewards of collaborative, interdisciplinary, multivalent working environments. But such environments remain somewhat rare in academic spheres. Indeed, for many grad students, solitary research remains the primary mode of operation, and the tenure track still remains a dominant, if elusive, career goal. While that's perhaps less true for digital humanists, many of whom have long engaged in deep collaborations across disciplines and institutions, the fact remains that very few graduate programs deliberately and systematically equip emerging scholars for the kinds of careers that happen at places like this. For change to be possible, it's essential that institutional norms and measures of prestige shift in favor of highlighting successful outcomes across a broader spectrum of possibilities. And it's important that graduate programs begin exploring ways that they can better prepare their students while maintaining the integrity of humanistic scholarship. Happily, there are a number of efforts underway right now to increase graduate students' exposure to and training for a wider range of careers. One such initiative, as Matt mentioned, is the Praxis Network, another project from my time with SCI, whose goals were to highlight programs like CUNY's Digital Fellows as a useful complement to the survey data. Together, the data and the examples of existing programs can serve as a foundation as other programs begin exploring ways that they can better equip their students for broader career outcomes. The Praxis Network consists of a small handful of programs that are student-focused, digitally inflected, interdisciplinary, and frequently oriented around collaborative projects. It doesn't aim to be a comprehensive database of all programs that fit this description, but rather it's meant to be a small cross-section of programs that are different enough from one another that together they give an impression of the landscape. We wanted to create a space that made it easy for people to see what makes these programs tick, and to compare and mix and match models to find potential solutions that might match their own home institution's needs. I think of each program in the Praxis Network as an instantiation of the kinds of innovative solutions that can alleviate the issues that the survey uncovered. Humanities programs have the opportunity to better serve their students, as well as the public, by really examining what our core values are and rethinking the methods that we use to teach them. The Praxis Network programs show just a few possible ways to move toward collaborative projects, public engagement, and embracing an ethos of openness and exploration. The Praxis Network makes it very clear that every program has different needs, resources, and strengths that it can draw on. But you might be wondering what you can do right now, especially if you're a graduate student. First, if you're not getting the information that you need from your program, seek it out elsewhere. You have excellent career services dedicated especially to graduate students here at CUNY, and Jennifer Furlong is here from the office that can help you with that. So talk to her afterwards if you'd like. I have a number of resources that are posted on my website, and there are lots of resources online where you can just start getting a feel for what's available. Second, connect with people. I mentioned how important Twitter and other online environments had been for me, and I think that that's true for many people. Spend some time browsing websites like Alt Academy, and also take a look at the Altac and Postac hashtags on Twitter. Find people that are doing interesting work and see if they'd be willing to talk with you about how they got there. Many of us are, especially because our paths are often not exactly what we expected them to be. Engage in online networks that are relevant to your own interests, and find a mentor that can support you, either at your institution or elsewhere. Third, think about the skills and experiences that you already have and how you might frame them for different kinds of jobs, and what else you might need in order to be a competitive applicant for the kinds of positions that interest you. Depending on your circumstances, you might consider whether to take a different type of job during part of your graduate program. I don't know the ins and outs of, for instance, TA-ships here at CUNY, but sometimes it can be a good time to explore other options while you're still engaging in your studies. Finally, there are lightweight training opportunities that you can pursue even if your home department is quite traditional. The Digital Humanities Summer Institutes, for instance, is a great example of short programs. It's just a week long. They enable students or faculty, staff, or anybody to pick up new skills while also building a strong network of like-minded peers. DHSI now has an East Coast offshoot at the University of Maryland as well, which significantly reduces the cost of participating for those of us here in New York. You should also check out nycdh.org for other workshops and chances to meet like-minded people closer to home. On the flip side, if you're responsible for a course or even for an entire program, there are a number of things you might consider. On a small scale, you could consider project-based assignments and informal mentoring structures within your own classroom. Encourage students to engage in broader networks, like Haystack, which is the Humanities, Arts, Science, and Technology Alliance and Collaboratory, or the mentoring program offered by the Association for Computers and the Humanities, as well as DHSI, which I just mentioned. These networks can help students to develop new skills while also exposing them to people that are pursuing various careers. You might think about developing one-credit or no-credit courses on topics related to professionalization. Could consider developing interinstitutional partnerships to share infrastructure or collaboratively work on a project. Partnerships might be between programs with close geographical proximity or programs that share similar goals and structures, or even that complement each other with different types of strengths. You could also think about gathering a list of people with Ph.D.s that are working within the university system who might be willing to mentor humanities graduate students. This is something that Stanford has done and that I think is fantastic. There are all kinds of people that are already working within the CUNY system that are doing different types of work than one might expect or be familiar with. Finally, and this is an especially rich possibility here in New York, try building partnerships with community organizations and companies that might have a mutual interest in building relationships with graduate students and contributing to their training through rotations, internships, and even job placements. So beyond what I've talked about here, so much more is possible within and across existing programs. Recognizing and celebrating a broader range of career paths has the potential to benefit not only individual scholars looking for rewarding work, but also the humanities as a discipline, as well as public engagement and perception. Explicitly valuing outward-facing careers and helping students to prepare for them is a key step in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Katina, very much. We'll have plenty of time for questions, so because we have acoustic issues in the room, if you ask a question, please stand up and identify yourself so everybody can hear. I'll let Katina.
Great, thanks. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Carmela. I'm a second year student in sociology. I was just wondering, you had mentioned in the middle of your presentation that you found the Ph.D. credential to hold different meetings in different places. I was wondering if it was ever detrimental or viewed negatively.
I never found it to be detrimental. I found it to be either value neutral or positive. I know anecdotally that there are people who don't find that to be true, that have found that in certain cases they felt that holding an advanced degree actually disqualified them from certain positions, particularly entry-level positions where there might have been a sense that that the person would need to be paid too much, essentially, because of the additional credentials. I haven't found it to be true in my case, and the only evidence I have to the contrary is anecdotal. So I think that I would encourage people not to be afraid of that credential, but instead to think about what is it that the employer is looking to hear that's valuable to them. The credential itself may not matter, but the things that you've done to obtain it may matter a whole lot. But they need that translation to be done by you rather than by them.
Hi, my name is Jesse. I'm Randy. I'm in the English program, 7th or 8th year. You talked about recognition and visibility, and I just wanted to get a clarification from you. Is that a value held by the? I'm trying to just contextualize it. Is that a value held by the people who are in the careers, or just in general? Because I feel if you're employed and you're happy in an all-act career, you probably are less concerned with those values. So I'm wondering about who you're assigning those values of recognition to.
Yeah, I think sorry. I hope everyone's been able to hear me all along. I didn't realize I was far from that mic. I think that's a really accurate observation, that once somebody is in a career that they find valuable and rewarding, the question of being ascribed that value externally becomes a lot less important because the work itself is valuable. Where I'm concerned is at the point where people are making decisions about the types of careers they'd like to pursue and about the types of messages they might be implicitly or explicitly receiving about what makes their studies worthwhile. Whether this is a master's degree or a PhD, I don't think it matters, but when university systems, whether individuals or structures within the system, are sending messages that that the expected outcome is professorship, is maybe a PhD after the master's degree and then professorship or whatever. That's where I think the question of what's considered valuable becomes really important. Where I see this playing out a lot is in the ways that universities, I mentioned this briefly, but the ways that universities talk about their graduates and talk about who's gone on to do what. A lot of times you'll see a program listing people who have gone on to obtain professorships at various universities, but you won't see any word mentioned of people that have gone on to do other types of careers. And sometimes those people are in really interesting and very high-level positions, but they often just sort of drop off the field of recognition. So as people are coming up through the system and looking to see those messages to get a little bit of guidance on what to do next, I think those messages are received very loudly, whether they're intended to be heard in that way or not. So I do think that this puts it can put a difficult burden on professors and people serving in an advisor capacity, because professors may not have a great deal of experience outside of an academic environment. And they shouldn't necessarily be expected to have expertise about everything else that's available. But I do think that being able to point to other successful outcomes and to be able to point students to other resources that are available sends a very different message than silence, which is what people often receive.
I have a question. I'm Steve. I'm a 46-year graduate student. So a lot of what you said was very familiar to me in terms of my own career. I saw the arc of your career, which I was interesting that you had it going downward rather than
Yeah, I thought about that actually.
Just trying not to get too much into that.
Don't.
But what would be helpful maybe for people to hear is how long a time frame was that?
Sure.
You know, from when you got where you started out of graduate school to when you got this position at the MLA.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to note that it started while I was in graduate school. So I got my Ph.D. in 2010, but at that point I was already living in New York and employed full-time at Sloan. So I had been working with the First Science organization since probably 2005, part-time while I was in grad school, and then moved to New York in 2009. Finished my dissertation while working at Sloan and worked at Sloan for about 3 years. So that was really the transitional period for me, was between 2009 and 2012. And then it was just in 2012 that I took the position at UVA. And that was a short-term position. It was an 18-month contract position. It was grant-funded, which on paper can seem problematic because there's also a risk of people feeling that as they're looking for other types of careers, they're ending up in different types of contingent positions. Mine wasn't an adjunct position, but it was short-term and on soft money, on grant money. However, those positions are not qualitatively all the same. For me, being at an institution like the Scholars Lab, which is where the Scholarly Communication Institute is housed, and working with people that I considered to be mentors and leaders in the field, outweighed the risks of taking a position where I knew that I had an end date by which I needed to find something else. So that was a risk, but it was a calculated risk on my part. And it was after that year and a half that I started working at the MLA. But I was actually hired at the MLA midway through my time at SCI. So one thing that I did actually find fairly liberating about having an end date on my position was that I could look for my next job very openly without worrying about whether my employer would know that I was kind of sniffing around for other opportunities.
And your position at Sloan would have been secure. You could have continued there.
I could have
You chose
continued.
to take the job in Virginia.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm really glad that you described the way you created a kind of professional presence on the web, because I meant to mention it during my introduction of you that, I mean, I remember the point when you sort of, came on the scene on Twitter and you started producing these wonderful blog posts that were really thoughtful and considered explorations of issues of scholarly communication, of professionalization, and I think you did a fantastic job of creating that presence. What advice do you have for students who feel some trepidation about creating an online presence, and how can you talk in a little more detail about how you've seen and made connections through social media, and have you decided how much did you think through that plan before you started blogging? Did you choose something to kind of blog about? Can you talk a little bit more about that work? Yeah, sure.
It was not a very natural process for me. It was one that involved a lot of deliberation and thought before I went into it. I spent a lot of time trying to listen before I jumped in and started talking. I tend to be very introverted, and so the thought of even, behind a screen, the thought of engaging with people that I respected very much, or people that I didn't know at all but were saying things that I thought were interesting, was intimidating to me. And so I spent a while just kind of following rabbit trails and finding people whose work I already knew, taking a look at who they were following, building up a list of people that I was listening to in that way. A lot of people on Twitter create lists, and so if you're interested in a particular discipline or a particular question, You can often find good people to follow by checking out other people's Twitter lists. I use Twitter as the main example because that's been the most useful environment for me. I also really have liked Twitter because of its ephemerality. For me, it alleviates some of the pressure to know that not everybody is reading every tweet that I write, that people dip in and out, they catch something and then it's gone, and if you say something that's kind of foolish, it's fine within a few days. It's not the end of the world. It's quickly forgotten, hopefully. As far as blogging, I'd had a personal blog for a while. I mostly, at that point, when I started it, I was mostly writing about stuff that I was reading, and I was doing that because I think I started at the point where I had finished my dissertation, was getting a little bit bored at work, and I was missing the kinds of intellectual engagement that I had had as a graduate student, and so I tried to create it for myself just by writing about what I was thinking about, what I was reading about. I had been very reluctant to take positions on issues that were in any way delicate, though. I wasn't sure how to engage with some of the questions that were a little more political, a little bit more charged. And a mentor finally encouraged me to do just that and said that, really the only way that you're going to be able to start working from the point where you're at is if you start laying claim to what you think is a problem, how you think, we might go about changing it, just start actually drawing some lines in my own online space, rather than approaching it in such a delicate way as I had been. So that was when I started. It was around that same time that I started talking with people more actively on Twitter and not being afraid to jump into conversations. At that point, I had a sense of it was important for me to know how people tended to respond to one another so that I knew if their responses to me were in keeping with their usual response, or if I had triggered something, emotional or upsetting or whatever. And I started blogging about higher education issues around the same time. So long-winded response, but that's how that came about.
Yeah. I have a question. My name is Jill Sirso. I'm a librarian here. It's just a definitional question, and maybe it's both for you and Jenny. By definition, do alt-ac careers have to involve having a Ph.D., or is that also something that's said about people with master's degrees?
Yeah, I really take a loose approach to alt-ac. I think that it's useful because it's useful, and when it's not useful anymore, then just let it go. So, for me, if somebody self-identifies as alt-ac, if they see themselves as having a scholarly identity and an academic identity in a different type of workplace, then that's what makes it alt-ac. It's entirely self-definitional. Some people don't think that, but I don't know. I think that it's really only a useful term because of what it allows you to explore and the different types of value that it allows people to place on the work that they're doing. But I mean, it came about because of a Twitter conversation that was happening between two people who intended it as just kind of a joke, referring back to old Usenet message boards or something like that. And they, it wasn't something that evolved in order to really shape a terrain, but it's come to do that because I think there was a need for something like that. So the survey was open to people who had master's degrees or combination of master's and MLIS, library science degrees, as well as PhDs. We didn't have a cutoff point in the credential in that way. Jennifer, I don't know if you have...
I would agree. I think there are people out there for whom the work has a very narrow scope, but I don't think that's useful. And I'm certainly not going to be the person who tells you, no, you can't call yourself.
Yeah.
What sort of politically sensitive or difficult topics did you insert yourself into, and how did you manage that? If you don't mind, I guess.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I'm just trying to think back to what some of those early posts were about. I think that I started blogging about this stuff when I don't know how many of you follow what's happening at the MLA and the conversations that happen around convention time, but a couple of years ago there was something called Occupy MLA, where people who, well, it's gotten so much more complicated now because it turns out to have been a very elaborate net prov or basically a Twitter hoax. At the time it seemed very serious, and there were people who were on Twitter creating identities of adjuncts who were dissatisfied with the MLA and who were, I think they were protesting the convention, but it seemed to me to be a really unhelpful rhetoric. That it started a really unpleasant dialogue between the people that were using the Occupy MLA hashtag and people that were arguing back against them about why the MLA was or wasn't the correct target for their frustration. The whole thing just seemed counterproductive to me, and it seemed to, in some ways, victimize the people who were already most at risk, the people who were already in contingent labor positions, who had very little ground to stand on as far as these conversations about what happens within scholarly societies. And I thought that it was kind of a short-sighted thing on both sides. So that was where I started jumping in, was when these Occupy MLA conversations were happening. And yeah, it's just been about, various things that have happened in the news from then on, often about either contingent labor or about graduate education and the ways people are or are not prepared when they leave.
I was wondering if you could talk in a little more depth about, I know you're kind of not that far into your term with the Modern Language Association, but if you could talk about, I wonder if we could get at some of the experiences that you've had in your work and talking about the work you're doing at the MLA, where, as far as I understand, a lot of what you're doing is really thinking actively about scholarly communication and how to make this new platform valuable and useful. And if you could talk about some of the ways in which the training that, as you described, PhDs typically receive has actually been useful in what you're doing.
Yeah, sure. So I think the MLA Commons is a really exciting platform because it's something that's quite new for scholarly societies to be doing. Because of the work that scholarly societies need to do, they're often inherently quite conservative. They're sort of defining the boundaries of the discipline. They help to shape the way that a discipline evolves over time. Because of that, they're often rather slow-moving by design. The MLA has done some really innovative work since before I have started there, but in thinking about what it is that's essential about the work that we do as humanists, and how we can push on some of the boundaries a little bit more to maintain that essential nature while getting rid of maybe formats that aren't useful or constraints that aren't useful. So one of the areas that we've been experimenting with this is in the ways that scholars communicate their research with one another, both formally and informally. And this is really a big part of what MLA Commons is designed to do, is that while there are still, the MLA still has traditional journals that look very much like journals across the field, we also see the value of allowing scholars a place to share their work when it's in draft form, share it publicly, maybe share it publicly when it's final rather than aiming to publish it in a traditional journal, and to get feedback on that work in different ways. And this kind of thing has been happening elsewhere as well for quite a while, open access journals and new forms of publication and so on, but it's really rare for it to be happening within the heart of a scholarly society. We have just recently, in the last few weeks really, opened up one of our journals, Profession, to be freely available to everybody. It's online, it's on the Commons. It used to be exclusively a member benefit, but we've changed the format of that completely so that it's available to a broader public. We've been opening up more and more of our work to more and more people. The job information list used to be something that was a member benefit. That's now available to everyone. And we see this openness not as something that we're just offering for free, but something that matters because it helps the humanities to grow in a healthier way. So the thing that's most difficult about that is not, and you may have, if you were here for Kathleen Fitzpatrick's talk the other day, she probably talked about the same thing. The thing that's the most difficult about that is not the technology, but the social components and the ways that people expect their work to be shared and viewed and received by the academic community. So a lot of the work that we've been doing has also been educational in helping people to feel more comfortable in these kinds of environments and helping. The academic environment is so prestige-oriented that it's been important for the MLA to weigh in on why these new modes of sharing and why these open forms of publishing our work are just as valuable, if not more valuable, to the profession than keeping them behind paywalls. So that's been one really important part of MLA Commons. The other thing that's been important about it has just been finding a way for people to connect with one another and to get their work done in more efficient ways. So rather than everybody meeting just once a year at the convention, the Commons allows people to engage with one another much more frequently, which we think also helps to advance the discipline. Alongside the work that we're doing on the Commons, we also have a grant from the Mellon Foundation right now, jointly with the American Historical Association, to kind of build on some of the work that I was talking about from SCI, to build out more data from people who, in this case, have Ph.D s, because we're building it on dissertation abstract records, but building out more information about what kinds of careers they've gone on to do, how satisfied they are, why they pursued those careers, and so on. And also increasing the kinds of activities that we have within our own association, at the convention and so on, for people who are pursuing all different types of careers. And I think that last point is really important because the MLA convention is so closely tied with the academic job cycle. Many people go for the first time or join the MLA for the first time because they're going on the academic job market. But really, the MLA is concerned with the study of languages and literatures, which is what all of us have done as graduate students, and that doesn't change once we go on to have different types of careers. And so encouraging the incorporation of activities about other types of careers at the convention and elsewhere within the association is something that I think matters a lot for starting to change the tone of how people perceive the various ranges of jobs that are possible.
A question that's a little off topic. It isn't just about careers, but it's about scholarly communication. And in the last few weeks, there was an article in the Times about the crisis in humanities. And Steve Breyer posted about it on the class blog, and then I wrote something back pretty quickly because I had read, maybe you know about this, Ben Schmidt's data crunching that he's done about the history of humanities education and the number of undergraduate majors and so on, and the numbers are that his findings were just utterly different than this most recent study that came out that the Times just kind of reprinted and said there it is. And the idea that there's a crisis in humanities has been this trope at least since about 1980 when there was a Rockefeller Foundation study. You probably know about all this. But it was interesting to me that here we had a scholar who had written about this and put it on a blog, which is the only reason I would have known about it. And he had lots of documentation and several different pieces that he'd written. And at the moment, and it was done within the past couple of years, so it wasn't something that was recent. And I tried to think about what would it be like if he or someone else approached the Times and said, actually, you don't have it right. This is actually this is a much better and clearer understanding. And having had some experience dealing with newspapers and such, I know that there's a level, especially at the Times, where there are several levels of editors, and they tend to have a bit of a group think. They kind of decide, well, that's this area, and that's what happens there, and this is another issue, and this is the latest from that, and you kind of want to get into influence that. So, long-winded setup, but I was wondering if that's something that MLA gets into, because it seems that it's really related to this issue of vitality of the field and academia, and other ways for people to communicate and make their research actually useful in the public sphere.
Yeah, that's a good question. And the really great thing about the Ben Schmidt story actually is that shortly after that crisis in the humanities piece, he ended up taking part in one of their Room for Debate pieces about a similar issue. So it was really gratifying, I think, to see his research being recognized in that particular venue that had gotten it rather wrong so soon before. But that is a really important question. The MLA certainly does, they handle a lot of media requests, and they certainly try to engage with the press as often as it's desirable to do so, and try to do so, carefully try to train their staff in such a way that that we can that we can represent the profession well within those environments. But it's really tricky. I mean, I think that the question of learning how to engage with different publics is never more apparent than in environments like newspapers, because the type of writing is so different. Even giving an interview for a mainstream media publication can go very wrong as an academic, so I guess I don't know exactly how to answer your question directly. I mean, the MLA certainly has its own sort of policies and procedures for that, and they've given workshops specifically for academics for learning how to work with the media. But it's something that I would love to see more in the classroom too, learning how to write and speak for different types of audiences. I don't think it's very commonly taught, and I think that it would be great. I think we need one thing that concerns me often in the question of public engagement for academics is that for some reason, particularly in the humanities, I think there's a fear that talking with different types of publics or writing for different types of publics means that you need to dumb down your thought process or your ideas. And instead, I think that your thought has to be sharpened in such a careful way when you're writing for a group that doesn't have the same background experiences that you can sort of assume within a room of fellow graduate students. So I think it's actually a skill that's undervalued and under-taught. I'd love to see more of it.
Time for one final question, if there is one.
I had one follow-up about, you talked about living with the philosophy of kind of not knowing about what was to come or what kind of like where your path would lead you. And so I was interested if you could speak a little bit more about how you in your life dealt with either the fear or the unknown. And you did mention that you had backup plans and stuff, so maybe that's one kind of tactic you used in this kind of more exploratory way of living where we're welcoming in opportunities. I think being able to be open and not be fearful and not constrain ourselves is such a obviously hard line to walk.
And it's hard to do in New York where the cost of living is really high and the stakes are actually quite high for, making sure that you've got something to fall back on. I don't know. I mean, one thing that I've tried to do is to sort of start various things in motion at once, not because I don't know which one is going to pan out. When I first moved to New York, I was also doing some freelance translation, which, as Matt mentioned, that just panned out now. I mean, if I had been depending on that for an income, I would have been completely up the creek. That's been 4 years in the making. I was looking into publishing to see whether that would be a viable option. And just trying to start the wheels in motion in various places to see kind of what I could reasonably pursue. I tend to be pretty risk averse, and so even though I do really value the unexpected twists and turns that my path has taken, I've also been very cautious about each step. So they haven't been cavalier decisions, and I think that's apparent in how I started, which was through a temp agency. I needed an income, and that was the way that I knew that I could get something. And I didn't expect that to work out into anything meaningful, but it did. So in some ways, having that backup plan was what actually enabled me to start moving towards a more promising direction. But I know that people's circumstances sometimes mean that it is not possible to take those kinds of risks. And so I recognize that this is a complicated question.
Join me in thanking Katina Rogers for a
Thank
wonderful
you.
presentation.